Hi, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the difference between processors versus effects. And in the second half of the video, I'm going to show you how processors and effects are used in Cubase as inserts and sends. First part, what's the difference between a processor versus an effect? Well, a processor takes an input signal, does something to it, and then we completely replace that input signal with the processed output signal. An example of this would be taking a guitar directly from the guitar sound, running it through a distortion processor, and then replacing the original guitar sound with a distorted guitar sound. We want nothing to do with the original signal. It'll still be there for us to process in other ways, but the end result replaces the original signal with the processed output signal. Effects, on the other hand, add something to the original signal. These would be things like a reverb, where we take an input signal, then we generate a new signal that's based off of that original, and we mix the two of them together. We're hearing a bit of the original and some of the effect. Compare that to completely replacing the original signal with a processed output signal. Hopefully you can get an idea for the difference there. And when we're using an effect, we generally have some kind of way to control how the mix between the dry original signal and the wet affected signal have a relationship to one another. Do we hear a lot of dry and just a little bit of the wet? Or do we hear a lot of wet compared to a little bit of dry? We call that the dry-wet mix. Let's take a look at some examples of different kinds of processors. Some of these you're already familiar with. For instance, equalizers. These are processors that generally are applied and the processed sound replaces the original. We take a vocal, we equalize it, we use the equalized version, not the original. Dynamics range processors. These are compressors, limiters, and gates. Again, the signal passes through them. We don't use the original, we use what comes out the other end. Distortions, like the guitar example I gave you just a moment ago. Pitch correctors. Everybody loves auto-tune. We don't want to hear that out-of-tune original vocal. We want to hear the nicely tuned output stage. Faders. These are things that control the volume on a mixing board, whether it's real or virtual or however it is. Faders control the volume, and the input is ignored after it gets through the fader. That's what we listen to. Same thing with pan pots. These control your left and right mix in the stereo field. Pan pots, the signal comes in mono, but the pan pot allows us to pan it to the left or to the right, and that's what we use. Okay, how about effects? What are some of the different kinds of effects that we're going to be using? Reverb, that's one that I mentioned. That's the ambient sound of a room or an acoustic space. You might even hear a little bit of the reverb of my dining room on this microphone. Delays, those are echoes like hey, 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 like you were hollering into a canyon. Then we've got chorus effects. These thicken sounds up, make them sound fuller, like a group of people singing together. Sounds a lot different than one person singing alone. That's how the chorus effect got its name. Flanging, which is a jet-like sweeping sound. Phasers, which do interesting comb filtering effects. Not quite as radical as flangers, but still an interesting effect. And pitch harmonizers. Now, the difference between that and a pitch corrector is that a harmonizer is going to take the original signal and create new notes based on some kind of an input, whether it be us playing a chord on a keyboard or telling us to play an interval of a minor third or a perfect octave. But we're still going to hear the original signal that's going to be blended in with this new pitch or pitches that are created by the harmonizers. So that's the difference between a processor and an effect. Now, let's take a second, go over to Cubase, and see how we use processors and effects on a track in Cubase. Okay, so you know the difference between a processor and an effect. Now we're going to look at how we use processors and effects in Cubase. On this track here, I have a recording of a violin sonata performed by Dr. Quentin Morris. I recorded this last December. Okay, so we can look at our channel settings by clicking on this little E button, which stands for Edit Channel Settings. And this brings up a representation of how the signal is flowing through this particular channel strip or the part of this track here. On the left, we have our inserts, and inserts are places where you put mostly processor types of signal processing. So we're talking compressors, additional EQs, distortion, guitar amp simulation, the kinds of things that we would use to completely change the signal. Cubase also comes with something called the channel strip, and we can look at it here and we can change the order of the items in the channel strip, or we can look at them over here. So these are also examples of processors that you would use. There's a gate, which is a dynamics processor, a compressor, which is a dynamics processor, an envelope shaper. This is a great way to maybe boost the attack of a kick drum. Deals with transients and release times. We have tape saturation and a limiter. And you can also change the order of them, I believe, in here too. Oh, that's remove. Okay, so I guess we do our ordering here. Like that. And then you saw them change over here. We also have an equalizer. So I'm going to put this back to inserts and turn on the equalizer page here. Now you get to see the EQ that's built into every track of Cubase. And we've got 4 bands, and right now the first band here, number 1, is a low shelf, so we can boost or cut a low shelf. The 2 middle bands are set up as peaking filters, so they boost and cut, and we can change their bandwidth or Q like that. We've got 2 of those, and these are all assignable. We can make these anything we want. And number 4, if I turn that one on, that's a high shelf filter. So that boosts or cuts above our selected cutoff frequency. Over here we've got a high cut, which is just another way of saying a low pass filter, and a low cut, which is like a high pass. They're the same thing. Add gain and flip the phase of a track. So those are also processes. So these are things that will affect and alter the original track, and we listen to what happens on the other end. All right, let's apply some processing and some effects and some EQ to this recorded violin track. I'm going to set up a couple of points where so it'll loop around. So what I'm going to do here is called setting my locate points. So I'm going to set one there, and then I'm going to go to the end, see what happens here. And that was the end of that take. So one there, and then we'll set the right locator over there, and we'll turn on loop. So now it'll just keep looping around that part. So we'll click the edit button again and open up. And let's see what happens if we apply some EQ. So this one's on. And let's turn our EQ back on. Now you can see this is the frequency response. This is all the harmonics. So the fundamental is down there. pretty interesting. You can see the whole harmonic series right there. Let's make this a little more narrow. So if there was a frequency I was looking for, you can sweep through the EQ like this. Like, oh, I don't like that. Let's pull it out. Like so. Or add a little bit more shimmer on the high end. And certainly totally cut the lows. We don't need those on a violin at all. Okay. Now we'll go over here. Now these are my this is my insert channel, so things flow from top to bottom. So let's add a dynamics processor, and I'll put a compressor on here. So that's showing me how much it's turning the signal down. Now normally I wouldn't do this on a violin track, but I'm just doing it to show you. And here's something I really wouldn't do on a violin track, would be, or maybe I would be to put it through a guitar amp. Like maybe a Marshall stack here. Nice. Let's back that off a little bit. Okay, so those are 2 examples of processing. 3 actually. Equalization, a guitar amp simulator, and a compressor. Now we'll add an effect, and I'm going to choose Reverb as my effect. So the first thing I have to do is, let's close some of this stuff down. And we'll stop, is we need to create an effects channel. So I'm going to go down here and say add an effects channel, and that Cubase asks me what kind of effect do I want, and I'm going to do a reverb, and I'm going to use this thing called reverence. This is a convolution reverb, so it's a representation of a room where they actually recorded the reverb of a sound and captured that and turned it into an algorithm. So here's French Stone Chapel. Let's see what it would sound like if we put Quentin in that chapel. So now that we've got that set up, we'll go back and look at our track. And here's a send. So first thing we need to do is tell it where we're going to send it. We're going to send it to reverence, and then we got to turn it on. All right, and this is how much. So now we're dry, and now I'm adjusting my dry-wet mix by sending more signal into the reverb. And if I want to try a different reverb, I can just go down here and try something else. Like, how about a Dutch concert hall? I kind of like that. Maybe not so much, though, of it. Okay, so hopefully you've got a better understanding now of the difference between a processor and an effect, and the difference between an insert and a send. We'll see you next time.